Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Love of Wisdom Book Club. I'm joined once more by John Robbins to discuss iGen by Dr Jean Twenge. This book looks at a number of social trends that are emerging amongst what is commonly known as Gen Z, but is known as iGen throughout the book. It is a US-based book, but I did some research in preparation for this and generally found that the trends matched up in the UK. That's something that we discussed quite early on. For the first time ever, there are sections that I've edited out, but this was not because they were sections of conversation. It's because we were interrupted by phone calls relating to a non-podcast related matter, and so I didn't think it was appropriate to put those in. I have kept all conversation as it happened to maintain the authentic, warts and all approach that I have aimed to cultivate throughout. I hope you enjoy this episode. It was a really enjoyable conversation for me, and yeah, enjoy. iGen by Jean Twenge, or Twenge, whatever her name, however it's pronounced. I've just listened to a podcast with her, so I should know how to pronounce her name, but I don't.
Do we repeat what we were saying before it cut off, that iGen aren't going to be impressed with that? They're going to be emotionally hurt by that, Rob.
Triggered. Trigger warning, I don't know how to pronounce the author's name.
Yeah. I get the feeling she won't care.
Yeah, I don't think she'll be that bothered.
No.
So, what did you think of the book?
It's a book that's made me feel nearly 40. I definitely come out of it being, whoa, like I am definitely like generation, what do we call it? Like middle dad. What? Oh man, it's gone out of my head, the phrase. Like middle of the road dad.
Oh, okay. Like I thought you were referencing your Instagram. I thought it was a shameless self-promotion.
Oh, no, it wasn't. But it's that phrase where it came from. Like, kind of centrist dad. That's the phrase. Centrist dad. I came out of it feeling, and just a little bit like, whoa. This is worrying for many reasons that we'll talk about. But also, there's some really good stuff coming out here for the future. I think that's probably a good little instant summary of where I am.
Can start off with the relentless passage of time that makes fools of us all.
Yes.
And how we are slowly making our way towards the grave with no ability to slow it down or stop or get off the ride. We just carry on. Entropy is relentless. But I don't think she really spoke about that in the book.
No, she was quite focused on her thing.
Yeah. So for people who haven't read the book and who are listening now, the book is documenting the rise of, that's probably an inappropriate phrase, but what I mean is the coming of age of what Gen Z, or as she has deemed them, iGen, because they were the first generation to reach secondary school age, to reach adolescence with the possession of smartphones being commonplace. So the majority of them will have grown up owning a smartphone, and a number of social trends that emerge in this generation that distinguish them from others. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. And she uses long-term statistical data to back up the arguments that she's portraying around social trends, and then also qualitative data as well. Which I find interesting, cause like that kind of part, I think, well, it's quite easy to pick out things with qualitative data to back up your argument. And it is a book written in America, with Americans interviewed that we think we need to highlight first. And some of the things in the qualitative data, I would say, are quite well placed within American society, and you can kind of see influences there in some of the things they're saying. But overall, like when you look at the qualitative data, there's stuff that I think, well, that's clear, and you see happening in our society as well.
Yeah, I think it is important to highlight that this was in America. And so what she did is she's used some fairly big banks of data to graph these trends that are emerging. And then what she's done is she's interviewed a large number of these iGeners or Gen Zs and used these interviews to sort of give a little bit of detail, a little bit of higher resolution to what is meant by this data. So say, for example, data showing that people are getting their driving licenses later, she would then speak to teenagers about why they're getting their driving licenses later to find out what sort of justifications they're offering up. But one of the things, and this was back in December when I initially read it, my first question was, how relevant is this to the UK? And I went using, fairly crude measures. I used Office of National Statistics and papers that I could find. I spent a couple of hours just looking over different trends and seeing if the same patterns were present in the UK. Every thing that I looked up was mirrored almost identically in the UK. So the general patterns, I think we can fairly safely extrapolate from one culture to another based on that sort of little bit of research that I did then. I wou't be able to tell you figures because it's been 2 months since I looked at them.
That's my fault, taking me ages to read the thing.
Yeah.
But you can actually just see that in society anyway. I don't know, it's obviously just my personal experience, but like from things being talked about in the news, it's very clear that some of the general trends and concerns that she highlights are stuff that's filtered into mainstream conversation already in the UK. When I read it, saw it was published in 2017, and it felt a little bit like, oh wow, in 2017 this probably would have been really massive because of it. It would have been eye-opening. That's the word, like really eye-opening. Like, wow, what's coming down the line? But having read it now starting in 2022, finishing in 2023, it's almost like a look back, of how we got to where we are, and it's really highlighted to me how good the evidence was and how well kind of predictive it was of where things could get to if it continued, or as this generation came through. You're kind of seeing it a lot in conversations like around safe spaces, around trans, around the emotional health of our younger people. It's all there and all being spoken about. So it's whilst it's it's not too old a book, it's actually really relevant.
No, it's not as old as we are. So, of the trends that she's highlighted, because there was quite a lot of them, one of the things I will say about this book is you can tell she's a scientist, because there was a lot of dry data, very specific descriptions of it. She was thorough about what she did. She wasn't drawing any extravagant conclusions from minimal data. She was very like, this is what the graph shows, this is what that means, this is that. It's very matter of fact. But what trends sort of stuck out to you most? Is there like one that's in your mind that you recall straight away, or are there like a few of them?
Well, yeah, most certainly. The one that sticks out in my mind straight away, and is pretty much the first one that she addresses because it ripples through everything, and I think we see it more in society now, is around the increase of anxiety for this generation in social situations and the impact that's having on their mental health. I think, that just really stands out, doesn't it? And from what I recall, her extrapolations from the data around that are it links very much to when smartphones became freely available to this generation and how they spent more time on them than socializing. And she had a lot of really good data and graphs showing that it's not that children are spending more time on phones rather than doing homework or other activities. It is actually they're spending more time alone on the smartphones. And one of the things you hear a lot is, but they're spending a lot of time talking to their friends whilst on it. So they are still socializing. And that's even something I've kind of considered and spoken to families about previously. It's like, okay, well, that child's still talking to people. There's still an element of socializing, even though they're in the bedroom. But then it pushes you to think of the next level of what that actually means in terms of development of social skills and development of emotional resilience that they aren't developing because it's all on a screen. They're not learning to deal with conflict face to face as much. And you see gangs, that's the wrong word. You see groups of kids out at the skate park or wherever, and you're like, oh, brilliant, they're out. That's what they should be doing. But they're all sat on their phones. They're not communicating. They get a feeling of being social, but the social skills aren't being developed. They're not learning how to deal with fallouts. They're not learning how to deal with the ups and downs of relationships. And then that developmental delay, as it were, is almost then coming through into adulthood. And you're seeing that now in the young adults and how they are approaching certain situations, how they are finding certain things that they find hard to deal with is a form of emotional harm that our kind of centrist dad generation, the millennials, etc., will just think as bizarre. It's well, we, the old men, you've got to learn to toughen up and deal with that. Which when I say that and you hear that sometimes with people saying oh, you just got to suck it up, you're like, well, yeah, there's a balance to be struck between the two. Sometimes those phrases are used to just get over anything, that including things that actually are an issue, like someone who does have depression. It's not always, the answer isn't just toughen up and get on with it. That's what our generation did. It's well, no, some support might be needed there, but equally, some of the things that this generation appear to be struggling with are not linked to more medical diagnosis of depression. They are with anxiety, but where has that anxiety come from? It's come from not necessarily learning the social skills and feeling offended quite quickly, feeling those needs for a safe space. And that it's quite a worrying thing as well. And it's also proving divisive amongst society, because it's quite easy just to shut others down if you don't like what they're saying. And you see then that coming forward into things like deplatforming, which me again finds quite a horrifying thought. You've got someone who's speaking up at university with extreme right-wing fascist views, and people are like, no, they have to be deplatformed. And I'm like, whoa, that's, I don't agree in any way with what they're saying, but very much one of these people, I defend your right to say it, and I defend the importance of that conversation so that those views can be challenged in an effective way. Whereas if you just shut someone down, really, you're kind of giving them almost more power. And from stuff I know in my own work, by alienating people, you can push them more towards the edges and more in their own thought, as they think they're right. They have more resentment than held, and it can actually make those things stronger, those arguments stronger. Those people will band together more because everybody's in their own individual world, and all you're creating is conflict as a result of not having those developmental skills of being able to challenge, being able to not feel hurt by someone when they're saying something you don't like. So I've gone off and covered a lot there in a bit of a tangent, but it does stem back to that anxiety and development of not developing the social skills.
Well, let's see how much of that I can I can come back on without completely losing track, because that was you covered a lot of ground very quickly.
We'll just pick one or two bits, and we'll come on to the rest of it again in a bit.
So, I did think though there was quite an interesting narrative effect to what you just said, because you started with anxiety arising from people being more social environments being more fragmented and people being isolated from one another despite their interactions, and then you came back around to the rise of, or the way that radicalism spirals as a result of social feelings of social isolation and fragmentation. So there was we've always seen these examples of people who are ostracized, or maybe the outcasts, the misfits, who hold extreme views, and when society turns their back on them, they tend to they see it as a confirmation of their conspiratorial thinking, and this is something that I've spoken about a few times on this podcast. Was one of the things that's emerged from social media is this magnification of pre-existing social patterns. So say previously, if you lived in a town, you would interact with people of all different perspectives, and you might say something really out there like the world is flat, and most people would go, what are you on about? Cop on, like give your head a wobble or something like that,
But we'll still stick around and have a drink together. Like we're staying in the pub together.
Well, you would still be included in that, but there would be this social constraint that prevents anyone from going too far off the deep end in any direction. And there were exceptions, of course, because we're human, we're flawed, we're complex. There is no perfect society where there are no exceptions on the fringes. There's always going to be some level of outcast and misfit. But what you now have is these fragmented social environments, but the most radical of those fragments can connect with one another online. And in some ways, that might be a good thing. There might be some, say, for a kid growing up gay in rural Ireland. So, although I believe Ireland has progressed in these regards, has become more progressive in the time since I finished living there 15 years ago or so, since I came to England. But one of my close friends came out as gay when we were in secondary school, and he was the only gay kid in the school.
He didn't come out to you. Knowing what you can be like.
If I remember rightly, he came out to... we were in a band, there was 5 of us, and he came out after band practice one day, and I remember him sort of saying, and I think there was a second of silence, and I said, as long as you don't fancy me, I don't care.
There it is, there's the Robin. and just for the record, those that don't know him, he's actually quite empathetic, and portraying a caricature of him.
Well, we all laughed it off, and I'm still friends with him to this day. I've got a lot of love for him and a lot of respect for him. But one of the positive effects of this is that gay kid in an isolated space, if they didn't have a social network, or maybe they might be able to connect with other people with a similar experience, and so that could be a positive. Equally, there's no corrective force anymore, because you just interact with the people who share your particular viewpoint. And so now, if you believe the earth is flat, you can go online and you can find a group of 12, 15, 20 people who also believe that the world is flat. And that's enough to sort of armor your perspective against all of the people who would detract from it in normal society. And so you're defended, you're basically reinforcing that sort of confirmation bias effect, and you never have any incentive to change. And so you get a feedback loop, and people spiral to the extreme ends of things and become really committed to these ideas. But a lot of what you were saying about the I think you tripped yourself up a little bit, because the way you phrased it, where you said about like, oh, just toughen up, I think you then felt guilty about the phrasing you used, and so and I think that as a result you sort of but I think there is, I'm going to pronounce another name wrong because I can't specifically remember his name. I think it's Nassim Taleb. He wrote a book called Anti-Fragile, and it's very similar to the ideas that are discussed in The Coddling of the American Mind with Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. And I know they reference Taleb as well. And I've spoken about that with my brother previously. But there is, human beings are anti-fragile. It's sort of the idea, the new idea, the idea that it sort of references is that we're fragile, that words are violence and that you can't be exposed to potentially difficult ideas or ideas that you disagree with, because that's going to do you emotional harm. And this is sort of an idea that has arisen recently. I mean, it's been around for a long time, but it's gained a lot more cultural power now. But actually, the inverse of that is true, and it's not just that we're not fragile, it's that we're anti-fragile. So when we're exposed to something that challenges us, we grow and become capable of more. And I think there is a psychological metaphor there, or analogy, with muscle growth. And I think muscle growth is useful to use as that analogy because it gives it a concrete form that people can envision. The way you grow muscle is that you overload that muscle and you create small tears, and through repairing the damage that's done, your muscles become stronger and more able to cope with higher loads and more endurance. And you get the same thing with your mental health and with psychology. And I've experienced this very much firsthand from lots of the activities I take part in. So the more I do martial arts, for example, the more difficult situations in that, the more I become comfortable with conflict, the less I'm afraid in these situations. And once upon a time, I would have been sparring and I would have straight away gotten overexcited. I'd been really tense and I'd been putting way too much power in. And that's because your fight or flight reactions are kicking in. You're getting higher rates of adrenaline and you're not as in control as you were. And now, after doing it for a couple of years, anyone who trains with me is going to be laughing now and going, he still does that. But I am much more relaxed, and I might get on the floor and someone's got me in a choke, and rather than tensing up and freaking out, I go, okay, take a deep breath, relax, and see what's going on. And so my psychology, through exposing myself to those difficulties, has been able to cope with a greater level of stress. And so one of the patterns that she talks about, again it mirrors the coddling of the American mind really closely, is that basically adolescents are becoming less independent. So they're being encouraged to do less for themselves. I believe Haidt and Lukianoff referred to it as sort of safetyism. We live in one of the safest times that's ever existed, although it's very easy to get confused about that because the media means that we're more exposed to the negative things that happen in the world than we ever have been. But actually, statistically, almost every measure of sort of danger, we're far safer than any generation that's come before us. But even when I was 13, I lived in the middle of nowhere in Ireland, and to go to town was an hour's walk, and I was allowed to do that sometimes. And I would walk an hour through country lanes to get into town to go and see my friends. I'd usually have a lift back because I wasn't doing that twice in a day. It was a bit much. But, we used to go out and we used to do all sorts of things, and we did get into trouble. There are downsides to it. I'm not painting it as a untainted good, because nothing is. But you wouldn't get that nowadays. And I remember in the interview I was listening to with Dr. Twenge, she said about a state in America, I can't remember which one it was. It might have been Colorado, but I might just be making it up, where it was actually illegal to leave your child on their own if they were under 14 years old.
Ooh.
And so that there's not that opportunity to test that independence and to build that resilience and those skills, whereas there needs to be that opportunity, because that's how we develop. And if you think about sort of Erik Erikson and his stages of development, adolescence is the point where you're striving for independence and you're trying to build your identity separate from everyone else, or separate from your parents. There's an individuation that's coming there, and we are sort of denying that opportunity for development. So it is a developmental delay that occurs from the lack of stimulation to do it. Just like when a baby's learning words, if they're not exposed to language, they don't learn the words. You have to expose them to gradually increasing difficulties of language so that they pick up on the complexities and the rules and the words, the pronunciations, and they can get from to daddy give me more money. So no,
I think you've basically, as you highlighted, I tripped myself up, and you've said all that much more eloquently than I was. Makes me think, all right, we're probably done here. You've summed up quite well. But bringing it back to the book, what you were talking about there, you used the example of the fighting, which is a really good analogy. But what it reminded me of was something in this book that I text you and was like, this is probably one of the most scariest things I've ever read. Was around the development of relationships, and it was someone in university, I think, that was being interviewed. Just rewind slightly, there's a general trend as well that this generation are having less sexual relationships and less intimate relationships, or just close relationships.
I just want to clarify, the text you sent me said this is the scariest thing I've ever read, and the picture just had the word sex. Just so the audience knows.
There we go. That's pretty much it. But this person in there was talking about how they didn't want to have a sexual relationship because they felt they weren't emotionally ready. That opening is absolutely fine. But then the reason they went on to talk about it was, and using evidence being like, when you have sex, it releases oxytocin, makes you feel attached to someone, makes you feel like you might want a relationship and the closeness. And actually, like, I need to be concentrating on work and life and getting by rather than that. And on the surface, you're like, okay, that seems maybe fine. Maybe you're a high-driven person who wants to do that. But when you start chipping away underneath, again, with all the other evidence and the other things we've been talking about, social development, I was like, whoa, like, that's really quite worrying, because they think that they're protecting themselves, but actually by not having these relationships, not learning how to deal with that, not having one-night stands or whatever, like, and or teenage relationships where you're starting to have sex that most are ultimately doomed to fail. You're not growing in relationships, you're not learning how to be in a relationship, you're not, again, dealing with those feelings of conflict with someone who you feel close to. You're not learning how to break up. Like, you are keeping yourself in your safe space and those barriers up. And I was just like, it blew my mind. I was like, well, sex is fun, but also, like, there are all those developmental things that you're just not giving yourself. And again, you just see it then in other areas of their life, where it's coming through, and it was quite worrying to me.
Yeah. For any kids listening, he means sex is fun after marriage.
I mean, arguably it's the other way around.
Well, it reminded me of something that I picked up from your first comment there as well, which is that the identity formation online is very controlled. You're not exposing yourself in the same way. I mean, in some ways, there's a bit of a contradiction here, because in some ways you're more exposed than you've ever been, because there is a entire world of people online who are ready to, or basically being asked to judge you on your photos with likes and comments, and it's a very extreme popularity contest in some way, with a lot of losers and not very many winners. So in some ways you're really exposed because your life is broadcast to the world 24/7, but in other ways you can carefully manage that. So the you that you're presenting, you can write a message and go, actually no, that's not the right way to phrase it, you delete it. You write a message, that's not the right way to do it, you delete it. And you basically find exactly the way you want to represent yourself. Increasingly guys are doing this, but it's tended to be more of a female thing for a long time, is taking hundreds of pictures to get the perfect picture to put on. And I have a friend who's recently joined dating apps for the first time, and one of the first things she said to me is, when did boys become so posy? Because apparently on Tinder boys are very much taking hundreds of photos to get one that's perfect. But so there's this curation of an identity, and I think this really plays into the trans thing, because you mentioned that briefly earlier, where people can manufacture a false identity. They don't have to grow into who they are. They don't have to deal with the real world and the constraints that exist. They can create a completely false persona online if they want to, and it's managed, and then an anxiety will arise from face-to-face interactions, because you cannot cultivate that. If you say things, unfortunately for me, you're responsible for having said them. And as I like to say frequently, I can't be responsible for the things I say, I just say them. But you know, and that is part of I guess the ethos of this podcast or the ethos of the editing of this podcast to some degree. I don't edit things when I'm doing it, because I don't want to get into this mentality of like, well, I have to perfect it, you know. What should I take out? Should I take out every little and and smack of my lips? You know, I don't want to get into that, because it becomes inauthentic, but it also creates a perverse incentive for me to manufacture something, whereas I want an honest conversation where I say stupid things, the people I'm talking to say stupid things, and we try and work out if those things are stupid and why they're stupid, and maybe become a little bit less stupid as a result. But you have to be stupid and you have to expose yourself in that way first. And so I worry how much adolescents' capacity to truly think is being impacted, because everything has to be manufactured. So you're not able to, because talking is part of thinking. You can't, you can only get so far with thinking on your own. And sometimes, you know, in a conversation, I'll say something. Very frequently I'll say something and something in my brain goes, you don't believe that? That was ridiculous. Why did you say that? That didn't even make sense. And it's very interesting editing several hours of footage of yourself speaking, by the way. If you want to get really neurotic about what the things you say. But then you sort of get this emergent phenomena of, like you say, safe spaces, trigger warnings, cancellations. You know, we cannot. It's wrong to have certain ideas. It almost feels cliche to call it Orwellian, but it does become Orwellian in the wrong think sense. You know, those opinions are not allowed. I cannot hear them. We will get rid of the words that allow people to think that way. And how much are they hampering their own development through not doing that? You know, and not exposing themselves to that. And it seems like a feedback loop to me. It's like everything's manufactured, so they then become sensitive to things outside of this manufactured, controlled world that they've created. So they then retreat further into this manufactured online world and try and restrict the impact of the real world further, which then it's just an ongoing cycle, and you sort of wonder how far does it go before that trend starts to reverse, if it does start to reverse, you know. I mean, the extreme end is the collapse of a civilization, but
I don't think we'll go that far, but I can see what you're dead right, you see that. There's a few things there, like one of the the impacts of what you're saying alongside this brought out in the book is that actually by not having those conversations, then when you do make mistakes in conversations, like this generation seem very quick to be like, well, you've offended, and challenging, rather than enabling development of your thought and having conversation. It's like, well, you can't say that, you're deplatformed. Oh, they've said that, you're a terrible person. And it's like you're highlighting how do you develop if you can't? Elliot Steele and Michael, I'm not going to pronounce his surname, and he'll probably laugh at that. Oh, another white guy that can't say my surname, but it is what it is.
Mispronouncing names is my bag today. You're staying out of it.
I'm just staying out of it. But they were talking about this themselves on their BTEC Philosophers podcast, that they'll say stupid things and they need conversation to learn and improve. And actually the most important thing is being able to have that conversation and someone to be able to guide them through why that might be offensive or not, and help them to then make their own mind up really whether it was how they actually feel about it. But then sometimes, like Elliot talks about, he does his comedy shows, and audience will come up after and be like, you can't make jokes about male suicide, and he's like, well, why not? And it's like, well, because I know someone that killed themselves, and well, I'm really sorry for you, obviously that's triggering, but this is just a joke, there is comedy there somewhere. It helps people often that are dealing with their own emotions, release that anxiety release through comedy, and so things like that this generation aren't seeing. They're missing that actually by being too quick to see the offense, to have their barriers up. Oh, people should act like this and should be acting like this, and then becoming very easily offended because of how they've developed. I've rambled, I've gone off a little bit. They're instead attacking rather than having a conversation, and also not enabling. I'm just saying the same thing, but their development. And that's just that really worrying trend. And you briefly went on to say, oh, well, where does this lead? Is it the end of society? I think one of the things to really point out, and I took away, was this is the first generation that have experienced this, the first generation that have grown up with social media, with smartphones hooked to them, and we're still as a society trying to grapple with what that means and how we can protect our kids. And we are trying, but there's going to be a massive delay. It'll be really interesting to see where this generation go as they get to their 30s, 40s. Will they catch up developmentally, or actually is this new mindset there to stay and will follow that generation through? Will they reach a point themselves where they go, whoa, actually, what are we doing shutting these people down? There's hundreds of years of philosophy and child development that highlight the importance of having free and open conversation, and we've just made a massive mistake. We need to make sure others don't do that. Let's get the right safeguards in. So I like to think on that bright side that hopefully it will even out again. I mean, it might cause a few wars on the way if they get into power, and you could see it as a rise of Orwellian fascism, can't you? It's because that's exactly where that thinking of intolerance leads you, but hopefully they get guided away from that.
I think perhaps we've both made our hyperbolic predictions for the future. I think we can move away from that doom and gloom slightly, because I still, although sometimes I sort of watch the social trends, and particularly everything that's happened with the trans issue, because it's one of the ones I followed most closely. I've literally committed hundreds of hours to researching that. I'm very closely linked in with that one, and I frequently despair at sort of the patterns that are emerging, the way things are developing. But there are also things that show signs of positive progression, and what I try and retain a faith in, and I generally do a good job of this, is that the human race and all of our ancestors prior have got through overwhelming struggle and strife and hardship and all sorts of other words that mean exactly the same thing. And, you know, they have got through that and overcome many, many challenges, and this is just a new one. And at the moment, we don't know how to deal with it, but hopefully we'll get a hang of it. And actually, one of the things that I thought from this, because there is some element of, you know, I remember being a teenager, vaguely, and it was difficult, you know, like there was a lot of time not really knowing who you are. And I did live part of my life online, but I also, as I've mentioned, lived in rural Ireland where getting online was quite the challenge. So I did live a lot of my life online, and I remember some of the influence that used to have. It was balanced out, but, you know, you would find forums of people, you would be able to find some fairly dark ideas online very easily, and you would fall into these spirals. And it makes me think of like psychogenic epidemics, you know, like anorexia. Like, you now get loads of social media forums and things like that which are pro anorexia and offer young girls advice on how to be anorexic, how to hide it from the parents. Cutting, you get the same thing. Trans, you get the same thing. And you have this social sort of contagion, and we always had social contagions in terms of, you know, hysteria. There was talk about that being social contagion. There's reports of mass giggling fits at convents and things like that. There's lots of sort of examples that have existed pre-internet or pre-iGen. But again, it's the inclusion of technology in that pattern acts as it magnifies the effect. So you get a more extreme version of it. And I see videos online of fully grown adult men wearing makeup, with speaking in an excitable voice. You know, it's really aimed at kids. There's bright colours. It's like very engaging, and there's some aspects of it, you know, like when you watch like actual kids programs, they talk directly to you, like they're interacting with you, and there's elements of that, and it's like these sort of influencers have hundreds of thousands of followers, and they're talking about, oh, I'll teach you how to go no contact with your family and to embrace your glitter family, which basically means I'll teach you how to isolate yourself from your family and this online group who will become your replacement family. And if anyone hears that and doesn't think that sounds like a cult,
that's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, I need to like check my daughter's kids YouTube account.
And that's it. And you know, we've seen this in our profession with countless things, you know, CSE, CCE. Oh, we're your friends, come and join us, we'll reward you. Now you're part of us. Now there's a set of rules, and it's hard for you to leave. And if you think to sort of teenagers being confused about their identity and trying to figure out who they are, and all of the difficult feelings that come with being a teenager, and then you get this option to be someone else, this option to have a controlled, manufactured, artificial presentation of yourself online. You can be whoever you want to be. You don't have to be this kid who's feeling socially isolated, struggling with this and that part of development. You know, you don't have to start thinking about getting a job or where you want to go. You don't have to deal with any of these pressures of life. You can create something completely artificial, and maybe all of your problems actually come from the fact that you aren't exactly this artificial person that you've created in your mind. Maybe it's reality that's wrong, and then you get groups of people who are reinforcing this idea and reinforcing this idea and reinforcing this idea. And this is where you get the rapid onset gender dysphoria phenomenon, which Lisa Lippman documented in her 2018 and 2019 papers, where she basically used a significant number of parental reports to look at the emergence patterns for trans children. Gender questioning children. I don't think trans children is the appropriate term to use, because I think that presupposes a conclusion as to what it means. But these gender questioning children, and historically there would always be patterns of emergence early in childhood of gender atypical behaviour and things like that, and it almost always desisted in late adolescence, and more or less always led to later life homosexuality. But then you started getting these teenagers, and it went from being almost exclusively young boys to, I think it's like a 4,400% increase in young girls presenting since 2012 or something like that, pretty much the same time as iGen. And
I wonder when it's going to come back to iGen rather than your pet project.
No, it is specifically relevant, because it's basically there's this option to be someone else, and then you have people reinforcing this idea that you could be something else. And all the things that these teenagers had in common from the research was that these teenage girls didn't show signs of gender dysphoria in early childhood. They emerged all of a sudden. They basically said they came out to their parents one day, usually by a letter. These are letters. Many psychotherapists report reading these letters and then basically being copy and pasted from the internet, because they're so similar to each other that they're scripted. And it basically says, I'm trans, you have to deal with it. And then they've already made up their mind, because they've been egged on by this specific controlled environment that says this is the source of all your problems, and you have the opportunity to be someone new. And that must be overwhelmingly tempting to a teenager who is struggling to figure out who they are.
100%. Like, just put me back in my own teenage years. Like, it's kind of similar, I think, to you in many ways. Like, grew up in the countryside, but there's that teenage years. You're trying to work out, who am I? Like, what am I doing in life? Like, what is my thoughts and views in life? Where do I belong? And we both grew up without the internet, and I think for us, kind of found like, oh, we live in that rock and pop kind of punk world. Like, we're kind of like, that's where we fit in and become that. And you're following those trends. It's like being part of a tribe, isn't it?
It's not a phase, Mom.
And it's something that helps you give meaning or understanding to who you are. But where without the internet, it wasn't like on steroids as it is now, is it? Those, you kind of felt part of a group, but you still had those checks and balances. You still had the social interactions and everything going along the side of it. You had people challenging your thoughts and views. Like, you had reality. Yeah, you had reality. And like, you go to school and there'd be people like, why the hell is your hair red? Like, don't be an idiot. What's going on with you? Like, whereas like now you kind of get the feeling that saying that to someone would be considered emotionally offensive. It's like, well, you can't say that to me. This is just who I am. And it's like, well, no, they can. And like, that's part of helping you learn and grow. In some ways it can push you into your own group, is it a bit more? So in many ways those trends were already there, but once you layer that on with the internet, the access to social groups through texting, through group chats, and you add in the isolation, like, it goes on steroids, doesn't it? It manifests even more and pushes you even more into that world, and harder, and there's a pushback even more, like, isn't there? You feel more kind of, well, you can't say that to me, it's who I am, I've got all these other people backing me up, like, I'm part of this, you sort of, you're not part of my group, rather than actually, no, when you're out and about, you have to learn to mix with other social groups. Like, I remember once a party went to, someone invited us to a party, and I said to my mate, oh, come on, let's go, we'll drive up. And I turned up, like, I can't remember, probably wearing like a Green Day t-shirt, like jeans, like looking like an absolute scruff.
I bet you've still got those clothes somewhere.
Probably, yeah. And we got there, and it was one of my more well-off friends, and I hadn't realised that actually the party they were holding in like this house that they have on their grounds, they decided was all like a black tie event. And it was like, everyone's like, what? You know, there's a massive social awkwardness there. But, you know, you have to learn to deal with it. It was like, well, my choices are like, oh, I don't fit in here, I'm going home. Or it's like, oh, you know what, like, just deal with it. Like, and most of the people there didn't know. But you have to find that kind of middle ground, don't you? And there's people there that like looking down, like, not necessarily just because I wasn't wearing what they were, but they would have looked down anyway, because that's not the kind of person who they normally hang out with. But, you know, you spend time, you find common ground, you have a couple of drinks and a laugh, and actually, like, you have a really good night.
In fairness, I went to a wedding reception last year, and I basically texted the bride and said, what's the sort of etiquette for this thing? Because my unconventional life means that I'm really, really bad at this sort of social etiquette. And she said, it's fine, just wear what you want. And I turned up about an hour after everyone else, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, and walked in. Turned out I didn't know anyone apart from the bride, and everyone else there was dressed smart for a wedding. Yeah. And I was like, 31 years to learn this, and I still haven't figured it out. But there's also a transience to it at that age, though, because, you know, I joke about it's not a phase thing, but lots of it is a phase. Because I remember, like, there was a point where it was 100% about grunge, and, you know, I had the plaid shirts and the long hair and things like that. Then it became about metal, and I wear like slightly more black and more angry sort of clothes, you know, like Slipknot hoodies and things like that. And then it became about punk, and I had a mohawk, and I had like torn up jackets with like patches on and things like that. And everything, you were like, this is my identity. And then 2 years later, it would be completely different. And there is a part of being a teenager that is experimenting and trying on different identities and figuring it out, but a lot of that is done as part of a peer group. You know, you do it with your friends, and you all sort of follow these patterns together, and so much of it's about social acceptance and trying to figure it out, and part of it's about rebelling against your sort of parents and trying to mark yourself out as an individual. But you do get this sort of trying things on. So that hasn't changed in a way, but what has changed is how much it has to interact with reality. And I know that some people will sort of have this belief that we need to get rid of all social stigma, and that any sort of social policing is bad, and there should be, you know, there's no need for anyone to conform. But you don't get a functioning society if people don't conform to some basic rules, you know. Murder is illegal. That's a form of conformity. We all agree not to murder. Some people.
I was going to say
some people still do. But as a society, we've generally decided that murder is off the cards as much as possible. And you know, you get examples like this. These are all constraints. We put a constraint on the use of physical violence for problem resolution. You know, if you have a conflict, generally, we're encouraged to resolve that by talking, or when it can't be resolved, we have systems in place to resolve those conflicts. We don't use violence, ideally. We've set that out as an ideal, and everyone's pretty happy with that constraint. There has to be some degree of constraint, and there also has to be people testing the edges of that, because we need to make sure that the rules are appropriate for where we are now, and that things haven't changed sufficiently that adjustments are needed. But what we still have to do continuously is find a means by which everyone can interact with everyone, and we can have a functioning society allowing for as much individual freedom within that. And we have to face the existence of reality at some point. And so I feel like maybe I've over-egged this idea, but to me the sort of retreating into online it ill prepares people for navigating that social negotiation, that the social mediation that creates identity, and through which the rules of engagement emerge for a society, and that allows us to grow and be prepared for adult life. Because you might be able to stay at home until you're 25, 30 years old now and avoid these things. Because one of the big trends she highlighted was the reluctance of older adolescents and young adults to go into work, because they didn't see as much point in it, and they didn't sort of plan out careers. They have very much had this idea that there's more to life than working, and there obviously is more to life than working, but life doesn't exist without work. It never has. And people complain about sort of this wage slavery concept. All that means is that you can specialize in one thing, because before you just have to work all day, every day, trying to grow enough food to survive. So work is an existential problem for life. And at some point they're going to hit that reality, because it's going to be like, well, you cannot just continuously live off of the benefits of other people's labor. You have to contribute, and that's, again, it's that social mediated exchange that allows society to function.
I found it quite interesting that you picked out that bit around the around the iGen in work, because one of the things that I took home was actually that there was an increased pressure to work to get a good job, because what the iGen were also noticing was that they ain't going to have as much free money as the older generations. We see from baby booms down, like, people are struggling more, like, to a degree, that it is harder to get decent jobs, that you are going to be saddled with a lot more debt, or not decent jobs, that the pay for the jobs is becoming lower and lower. There's a lot more debt that it comes with going to uni to try and achieve those jobs. Like, getting on the housing ladder is a lot harder. So they're actually feeling more pressure to do well, which is part of the reason that they are locking themselves away from things like relationships, alongside what we've just been discussing, the developmental things that potentially could be causing them to struggle with relationships with others a little bit more. But there's also that, well, if I want to achieve, like, I've got to put so much focus on that to do well. And one of the takeaways, she was saying that actually iGen could be really good for employers, because they are so focused on doing a good job and achieving, that actually they're much better to come into the workforce than millennials that overall had more of a sense of entitlement. They came from I think, was it right? Baby boom generation? It's like a gap, isn't it, between the next one? Or was it Gen Z for the millennials? I'm rubbish at this, but anyway, but basically the millennials came with that sense of entitlement, like the world was good, like, you know, they'd seen their parents achieve really well. They think, you know, everything's going to be easy. It should just come to me. All I need to do is try hard, but not that hard. Like, I'll just turn up at a job interview, be like, oh, well, I've been to uni, so therefore you should employ me. It's like, no, actually, we need the work ethic. We need all these other things. And they were more of a nightmare for employers to to bring in and actually say, no, this is the reality. Like, if you want this, you got to work for it. You've got to learn these skills along the way. You haven't just born with it. You're not some sort of gifted person. Whereas the iGen are realizing more that they will have to strive. But that's what I took away. But what you took away was actually there's less desire to work for some of these people, because they're like saying, oh, well, what is the point? What is the money that's I get back for the work I put in? I can stay at home online and do nothing. So what it raises, actually, they've got these two different groups coming through as a result. You've got some that are just really driven and some that are just going, I'm exiting. Like, what is the point in this? And especially now they've got more of a allure to exit, because I could just live online. I could still have some form of life and social interaction in my bedroom. I don't need as much money to live that life. Whereas before, you'd need a lot more cash to get out and socialize and do things. Otherwise, you'd just be sat in a room on your own.
I think, I mean, in fairness, that there are some aspects of different trends that conflict with one another, but also I was looking over the graphs in the book earlier to jog my memory, and so it's entirely possible that I've slightly misinterpreted the graphs. Is this school again?
No, it's not. It's my wife. It's all right. Carry on. I'll just see what's going on.
That's fine. But the two things might not be mutually exclusive, right? Because there might be a reluctance to enter the workforce because they don't see or don't perceive there being the same opportunities that they would like, and that their drive is keeping. Because I've met people throughout my life who, and probably been one at some point, who are reluctant to take something that they don't see, take a route of employment that they don't see as ultimately a step towards where they want to be in the long term. And it's not always that clear how those things work, because actually being in employment makes you more employable instantly, regardless. And sometimes it's getting that experience of being in work, of negotiating with colleagues, of working in a team, of doing the lower levels of labor that enable you to move up the progression. And sometimes that can feel abstract. It can't feel real. It can't feel as real as you would like it to in terms of your progression. So it's entirely possible that there is a reluctance emerging from that, and that actually they do go in eventually. And so that it might be a unrealistic expectation of the job market. It might be issues within the job market. There are sort of lots of different explanations of it, and I feel like it's a very, very complicated thing, the economy, because on one hand, we sort of talk about the rates of inflation and how the term sort of real wages gets used to be the amount you can buy for that wage, and how that decreases over time. But it depends sort of what scale you look on, because if you look at how much you can buy for, it might not be per pound, but it might be for how much you're earning from so many hours. How many work hours does it take to buy something now compared to 30 years ago? And generally everything's gotten much cheaper. An example I always like to use is that back in 1950, an hour of lighting for your house, I think it was something like an hour or 2 hours of labour to be able to afford that. I've got that slightly backwards. There was, for 1 hour of work, you would earn so many hours of lighting. But nowadays, even with the current energy crisis and then the rising rates, which are causing a decline in the quality of the material quality of living that we're able to afford, even then you can earn an hour's worth of lighting in a matter of seconds in a minimum wage job. And things that would previously have been luxuries like microwaves, freezers, TVs, smartphones, to bring it somewhat back to the book, are accessible to most people, whereas they used to be exclusively the luxuries afforded by the rich, because there wasn't enough of a market to sell them at a cheaper price, because they had to recoup their money through very few sales, so they had to be expensive. And so it to me, there's two different sort of patterns. You get the expectation and the perception, and then you get the reality. And it's very easy for like everything to be getting cheaper, but people to perceive them getting more expensive in some ways, if you know what I mean. So it's like two completely contradictory trends, but they both emerge because of the way we interact with the economy being confusing.
Well, yeah, no, definitely. But there's certain things, isn't there? Like, you're dead right. Like electricity, like some luxury goods like microwaves, the example you used, are a hell of a lot cheaper. That's fantastic. But then the amount of hours you have to work now to buy a house compared to what you do is gone up. So there's just different bits of the economy that have, some bits are cheaper, some are more expensive. But bringing it back to the working and going into work and employment, which was in the book, again, that was something that really stood out to me, because it's that developmental delay that seems to be going on. My first job, I must have been, I don't know, it was probably about 11, and worked at the local garage up the road for like £3 for a couple of hours. And it was like my uncle's brother, like, so that's how my mum knew. It was, can John come up? And like, it was like sweeping the floor court, maybe pottering, helping in the shop,
probably
like washing a couple
sweeping
in
it quite
cars.
badly, I'd imagine.
Awful. Like, there's what I was going to come on to is it was awful. It was very much like him just doing my mum a favour for what was nothing for him. And I remember the day he was like, this isn't going to work anymore. It was because I was young. I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't have the ability to kind of see a problem or see what job I should do next and go and do to it. So I was always going back to him. I've done that. What shall I do next? He was probably like, well, you've not really done it well, but whatever. But had the ability not to say that and ruin my, sense of achievement as a little kid. But there was a day where he was trying to sell a car and he was in the office talking to people. So I just kind of sat on the wall outside, and looking back now, it must have been for like half hour, waiting for like my next direction. And then afterwards he was like, it's been good, but no more. And I was like, oh, cool, thank you very much. Like, it's been good. And then moved on to paper round and working in a shop and working. I know I worked in McDonald's for a couple of months and pubs and all sorts. But those skills you're learning on the way and those interactions and like looking back and learning from the mistakes that you made. So when you are an adult and able to enter the workforce, like you've got a lot of experience behind you, and not just the experience of doing work, but the experience of working with people. And developing those skills of working with people that don't see life the same way as you, that you have to deal with conflict, conflicting ideas and opinions and approaches, and find a mutual way forward. And if you've got a generation that are struggling with that anyway, and then also it's another door that's been shut to them as a way of experiencing the world, isn't it? And so again, they're even further into their early adulthood without having the opportunity to explore this, and that's really worrying. And there is a degree, or there seems to be, I think, two things a bit at play. Is one, like you were saying earlier, is this generation safety and parents wanting to keep kids safe because it is dangerous out there, in some ways, but not as dangerous as some people think. But so they're wanting to help protect their little little like blessed child or whatever they are, like, and keep them safe and help them like think, no, study so you can get a good job later, but they're not seeing the detrimental impact on it. And then the other thing is that, back to the economy, that some of the jobs that used to be done by teenagers are now being done by adults as well. Like, there aren't so many young teenagers working in McDonald's. Like, they're not always run by like 18 to 20-year-olds anymore. Like, you go in, there's a lot of older people in there because that's the job opportunities they're finding. So there's lots of things at play here, kind of keeping younger people out of the jobs market. Like,
well, I think there's a few interesting things that sort of emerged there, because I also had an similar experience, but I would have been 16 where I got a job as a kitchen porter, and I was absolutely awful. Like, I couldn't wash up to save my life, and like if I came across something that was difficult to wash, I'd just like put it back still dirty, and they'd be like, what are you doing? And I'd be like, well, it was too hard, I don't know, like, how am I supposed to, like, there was no initiative or anything like that. There was, honestly, and they sacked me after a few weeks completely reasonably. Yeah. But at the time I was like, well, I don't understand what I've done wrong, and I had to go through that experience to learn it, and I had to go through many other experiences of, you know. And then, like, there was a point where I became fairly good at doing a practical job, but I was a nightmare because I just had a completely idealistic view of the world. And that would, and I'd be there like 18, 19 years old and working with people who were in their 30s and 40s, and they would just be like, this guy's an idiot. What is he on about? Yeah. Like, I can't wait till life grinds that out of him. But it is a crucial experience, and the longer you put it off, the longer you sort of delay it. But I think that there's a few things that sort of emerged there, because I was listening to your story and you were saying you were 11 and working at this garage. And I'm like, how would we respond to an 11-year-old working at a garage now? That would be going for a social care assessment probably. If we had a referral saying there's an 11-year-old who's being asked, being left out on the wall for half an hour and being paid to sweep the floor for what the loose change in someone's pocket, we would be like, that sounds like modern day slavery. And that would be a concern. But I also think, like, this is a contentious point. It's something that rarely gets considered. When you bring in minimum wage laws and you continuously increase the minimum wage, what you do is you artificially raise the level of the wage compared to what the market would determine for some jobs. And the incentive there, an employer is going to have to employ less people for the same amount of money as they would otherwise. And the primary group that are affected by such things are teenagers and people without marketable skills, because the more skills and experience you build up, the higher your market value is anyway. And so when you're talking about what would you traditionally have been the minimum wage jobs that teenagers would have done, so like, kitchen porters, like sort of just assistant work, like sweeping the garage, or like cleaning work, or pubs and restaurants and sort of these different places, fast food places that teenagers would have traditionally worked for very low wages while they built up the skills and the experience necessary to earn higher wages in more satisfying jobs. Once you raise the wage that's paid for that, then the employer's going, well, I'm putting out a lot of money here and I can only employ one person. Why would I risk that amount of money on a teenager who's going to be an absolute liability and take ages to train up, when actually there's an adult who could do it, who's got more experience and therefore is going to do the job to a better standard? And so I feel like it's one of the trade-offs of creating minimum wage laws in the way we have, and people can debate about whether or not that's a good thing, and that's a completely fair debate to have. But an inevitable trade-off of an increasing minimum wage over time is that teenagers are increasingly pushed out of the labour market and denied those opportunities to build up those experiences. I used to get paid £5 cash in hand, and I remember finding out that the person before me had been had been paid more than me. I think she got like £5.70 or something like that. And I went to the manager and was like, I should be paid more because the last person got paid more. And they said, well, we can pay you more, but then we'll have to put you on the books and you'll pay tax on it. And so you'll come out with less. And I was like, okay, I'll shut up then.
But at least you had the confidence to like, well, of course you did. You were young to go in and say that.
Yeah, there's a thin line between confidence and stupidity.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, danger of becoming a conversation about the economy rather than the generation. Yeah. I think I just wonder there how accurate a description that is, because like, was it the fact that the wages were lower that these adults weren't going into that job? Like, whereas now they're looking at it and seeing that, oh, it's attractive because I can get paid an all right wage. Like, or is it that actually that there were other jobs for these adults to go to, and now there are less jobs? Like classic examples, say around here, like the coal mines all shut. These people had no other higher wage jobs to go to, so have been pushed into more jobs that were traditionally done by teenagers, rather than it being that the wage rise meant that the employer was... I mean, the wage rise has meant the employer will be looking, actually, do I have a teenager or an adult? But at the same time...
Or previously they might have been able to have both. Because that you instantly decrease the number of jobs by increasing the wage that has to be paid for a job.
But no, I would say they wouldn't have had the option, because the adults wouldn't have been going for it because they were down the coal mine.
Yeah.
There wasn't a surplus of free adult... not free. There wasn't a surplus... Certainly not free. There wasn't a surplus of the adult labour.
Well, the children might have been going down the lines
as
well, to be fair.
That's true. But also raising those minimum wages protect the adults that were in those jobs, because there are some adults that do those jobs and that's the jobs they're in, and actually they needed to bring home enough to live as an adult, whereas a teenager doesn't, which is why the minimum wage for a teenager is still lower than an adult, like to kind of reflect that as well. So we've kind of gone off a bit. I guess I just was like, I can't let that fully go because I think there's some opinion on it. But what it comes down to is, as we were saying, it's like getting the teenagers, getting the work experience, getting them out there, socialising, realising those other skills to improve the anxiety that is rippling through our kids. And we are seeing that in the general statistics of our children and this generation, and the mental health needs going through the roof. And it might be a bit too easy to go, oh, well, it's just put it on the smartphone, and there probably will be a lot more complex situations impacting. But I think what this book is really highlighting is it's quite clearly something quite significant impacting. And over the last couple of years, we kind of all know it anyway, especially, I guess, like some of our generation that didn't grow up with the smartphone. For me, like, the internet and everything became really accessible just as I was leaving uni. And like I, as a lot of people I know, kind of went through that phase of Facebook and like MySpace, creating your own thing, getting like your own persona out there. And then like quite quickly, or not, after a couple of years, you're like, this is nonsense. Like, why am I spending so much time on this? Like, what I really enjoyed was going around with my mates and getting drunk, and partying, being with them. And actually, there's a lot of hate here. Like, let's just pull away from this. Whereas the next generation haven't got those memories to fall back on quite so much. They're having to learn that as they develop. So it's potentially like taking longer. It's not, isn't it? They haven't got that thing to think, well, this is new and it's actually not as great as I thought. It's like, oh, this is life. Oh, actually, life isn't as great as I thought. I have to find another way. I have to learn to socialize, which is a harder way, I think, of approaching life.
I think that with the, I mean, obviously, to say one thing has caused all the changes that have happened across a generation would be reductionistic beyond belief.
Yes.
You're like, so society and people are far more complicated than that. And but You're not. No, Simple John. Apart from Simple John, society and people.
John. I mean, the way I've stumbled over my trails of thought during this is highlighted definitely Simple John.
But with phones, I think the research in terms of their impact on mental health, whether it's done on an individual level or on a scale, is fairly concrete. They have a negative impact on mental health, increased anxiety and things like that. Like we know that with smartphones fairly solidly. And I think when I was listening to the podcast earlier, she was saying that many of the trends, you know, some of them had started before the rise of smartphones and things like that. These were continuations of trends. But with the mental health, it was like smartphone increases, everything drops off a cliff. It was like it's almost like perfect.
Oh, yeah, it was.
Like it's one of the most sort of accurate. It's very hard to find anything else that could have had such a huge impact. And I experienced this myself to some degree, and it's always a little bit chicken and egg. But if I'm experiencing low mood for whatever reason, I will go on my phone and use social media way more. I never know if that's because I've been on social media way more that my mood's gone low, or which way around it is. But either way, the problem exacerbates itself.
What it's saying to me is, I'm in low mood. I need social interaction. I need something to help me get out of this. Or I'll pick up my phone and get it quite quickly, but you're not getting it. So like you think you are, like you're getting the dopamine hits, but you're not actually getting what you need. Like by going on social media to get the socializing, what you need to do is like get out. Like isn't it? But it's hard. It's tough sometimes. Well, it's not as a teenager where it's like, oh, just walk out the house and go meet my mates. Like it's like, oh, who's around that isn't working, like isn't putting their kids to bed that I can actually go and see. Like,
well, yeah, and that's sort of what I was going to come on to a little bit.
Oh, sorry,
it's fine. It's fine. Because I think that one of the things I noticed in that pattern that it's attempting to artificially fill a hole that's left by lack of socialization, and usually I've gotten fairly good at this now. If I start to notice my social media use increasing, which is pretty easy to notice because at the moment I use it for about 10 minutes a day, which is a miracle considering how I used to be. But if I start to see it increasing, there's a little flag goes up in my mind that goes, you need to go out and see people. You need to do something sociable because you're looking for something false here. But it is addictive because the dopamine hits that you're getting from it increase neuroplasticity, or the more dopamine you have present in your system, it mediates the sort of wiring of the brain. So basically those dopamine rewards encourage repetitions of the behavior that triggered the dopamine rewards. So every time you're using your smartphone, you're reinforcing the likelihood of you using your smartphone again in future. So again, it's like a sort of feedback loop. You get into this cycle where you're increasing it, and you see it when some teenagers or some kids get so distressed when you take their phones or tablets or whatever off of them. And part of the reason for that is that you've got this neural circuitry that's been reinforced over and over and over again. But part of the reason is you're ostracizing them. You're cutting off their primary means of contact with their social group, and we are social animals who've evolved to be in contact with our social group, and being disconnected from your social group unexpectedly in evolutionary terms would have almost certainly meant death. And so of course you're going to get a negative response to that, because if you were, say, a child back in our generation, your separation from your social group would be like, okay, it's time to go home now, get on the school bus, you get off, you walk home, and then you're going to go back the next day. But that's part of the routine, that's part of what you're used to. It's sort of, if you look at the experiments around attachment theory and things like that, kids get used to their mum leaving as long as they reliably know that she's going to come back, and they build up that sort of sense of independence. And you get that with your social network as well to some degree. But the immediateness and short-term nature of social media, like I was saying earlier about it being 24/7, it's always there and you're always connected to it. So you never expect to be separated from it. You don't build up that capacity to self-soothe and go, it's going to come back and we're going to have that network again. This independent time is a natural part of my being. You don't get to integrate that experience into your working model of the world.
No, definitely. And I was just thinking there actually about pre-internets, like me as a kid, and you know, the dopamine hits and your social interaction. Like there are, just for the sake of balance, I guess, for a bit, like examples where actually that can get you into messes, even as a normal person, like, sorry, without, I'm not a normal person, but without the phone. Like in my wedding speech, like with all my mates there, I described myself in my teenage years as like a hedonistic libertarian, because it was just very much like the kind of, to a degree, as many teenagers running around doing what you want to, like, you know, it wasn't like setting cars on fire or smashing shops, but it was a lot of socializing and drinking and having fun. But the dopamine hits I was getting from that through the socializing and doing these things was really high, to the point like I would really struggle being separated from friends and not going out and doing stuff, which is almost like a reflection there with the smartphone and those dopamine hits. And I'm not advocating that someone goes and does what I did growing up. I don't think it's good. And it's one of the benefits that we are seeing from iGen, is that they are drinking less and doing some of these things. Yeah. But
it's not big, it's not clever, but it is fun.
Exactly. But there's the two extremes, isn't there, that actually... And I'm very aware, like when I start talking to other people, like of what they did as a teenager and when they went out drinking and partying was nowhere near as much or to the same degree. And I'm like, oh yeah, I was definitely on that outer edge out there. So it can happen. You can have those problems without the technology, is I guess what I'm saying. But it's important just to kind of bring it back to that middle road, that for most and the average Joe, like that they weren't having those things, whereas now the average Joe is probably having those dopamine hit issues because of the smartphone. And
again, it's always, and I sort of come back to this theme whenever I talk about anything vaguely technology, it magnifies a pre-existing pattern. And you know, humans do have that tendency to become, I mean, I was also a very hyper social teenager, or I wanted to be hyper social. My rural existence didn't allow it a lot of the time.
I had the rural existence, but what I would do is I'd be like, Friday night is like, oh, I'm going out, I'll see you later, and then turn up 3 days later, because it was like, oh well, how am I going to get home? Like, it's miles away, I can't be bothered to walk an hour and a half. But my mate over there is having another party. I'll just go and stay and crash on their floor.
That happened to me more.
Can't be bothered to walk away, go home. Like someone else is having a party, I'll go there.
That happened to me more once I came to England, where the transport links were a little bit better. You know, the period of my life in which I was willing to walk for over an hour to go and see people was very limited, but that was the only option for getting there. But I'm curious, because we probably need to be wrapping up a little bit because of...
I've got to head off.
Yeah, but I'm curious, based on sort of reading this, what impact has it had on you as a parent? You know, is there something that it made you reflect on that? Because I think for me, I mean, I don't have kids at present, but there's a real difficult decision to be made with regards to how you allow your children to use technology as a result of this. And I'm curious as to what that's meant for you and how, if it's changed anything, or how you look at that.
That's a really good question. When you said it, I was like, oh no, not really. And my first thought was going back to how actually we've become more aware of this in the news recently and some of these problems. But when this book came out in 2017, it was probably more at the beginning of recognizing this.
And funnily, we've got the whole way through without mentioning the effects of COVID and lockdown. I don't know how we've missed that.
That's a very good point. Yeah. Well, again, it just put it on steroids even more and kind of skewed the figures probably to a degree. But that's not true. What I did take away and have realised is that I have become more aware of the need to make sure I get my kids in clubs and out socialising, which is something I was always wanting to do anyway, because I look back on my childhood and doing clubs and activities were really good. And was it this book? No, I think it was one of the other ones that we did about the importance of like Cub Scouts and things like that.
That was
the Boy Crisis.
The Boy Crisis.
Well, funny enough, I've made sure like my daughter got into that. But like for those skills that he talks about in there, and the socialising and learning practical stuff. And my son's going to be joining that in a couple of months once they've got a space. He's on the waiting list. But it gave me an additional awareness of the importance of that and the importance of getting them out and the importance of, doing clubs with other children. And something I'd already started doing now because she's 9 and we're out of lockdown is trying to get some of her friends like invited over for a couple of hours. Like there's two things there. One, I've found that it's a lot easier as a parent when there's more kids, like because you're not so much their sole form of attention, but also it's just really important for those social interactions, isn't it? For them to have a good time, build those relationships on a face-to-face level. Because sometimes she said to me like, "Oh, can I get my friend's ID for Roblox so we can meet and talk and do things?" And occasionally I've said, yeah, it's fine, like because this is something that they need to learn to manage, but very much so I'm making sure that there is that balance of out there meeting people face to face. But one of the things that also then led me to reflect on is, and I never think of this, but I'm privileged to be able to do that, because there are a lot of families that can't afford clubs, that are struggling to put food on the table or keep the electric going and the gas on at the moment. And those kids that haven't got that opportunity, they're the ones that I really worry for, because I think there's a lot of families out there like myself that, you know, not rich, not doing amazingly well, but have some free cash, you know, like that they can invest in their kids. And a lot of us probably be aware of this and can see that problem and trying to solve it, whereas those that haven't got the cash, where those kids would have predominantly just grew up playing on the street, you know, causing chaos as kids do, but you know, that's something we have to accept in society, isn't it? Like kids go and cause chaos, like it's all part of the development, like we're saying, you're learning from your mistakes. You know, we've already said that murder is wrong, so as long as they don't go and do that, you know, like another extreme things, it's actually part of learning. Like you're knocking on someone's door and running away, like it's inconvenient, all right, to go and open the door, all those kids again, like, but you know, what harm has really been done? And it's helping them socialize, whereas now it's a lot not harder, but the draw of not going out there is so much higher, because they can be on their computer, they can be on their smartphones, and the parents are probably preferring it because they're not getting neighbors turn up being like, "Oh, your kid knocked on my door and ran away." Like, so it's that portion of society that I worry about even more, and that's a portion of society that will already have constraints on access to resources as it is, and that could potentially be quite a toxic situation for many people growing up, and it will be interesting to see long-term trends around that.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting, and like the impact of COVID and the amount that I feel that like has just shone a massive magnifying glass on this. But I do wonder, and I don't have an answer for this at this point in time. It's more just something that I feel I need to commit some time to thinking about, but is when resources are scarce, is smartphones for kids the best way to use those resources? Or is this potentially something that we should be trying to reverse the trend and let our children develop a little bit more before we allow them that access? Because kids get smartphones very young, and I always remember as a teenager, experimenting and things like that. The advice was always, now's not the time to experiment because of your neurological development. Your brain is developing, and you don't want to mess with that too much. And I can't help but feel like after all of those warnings, we're now giving kids something that is having potentially equal or greater detrimental impact, and it's just been completely accepted. And to me, even at this rate, by the time I have kids, I'm likely to have some free money and have a choice of what resources are available, providing I don't completely mess up everything that I'm doing in the meantime. It's still very tight at the moment, but is, even with the luxury of choice to provide both, are smartphones and technology the priority for children?
No. But as a parent, it's so much easier.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Sit down and shut up.
Yeah, that's it. I want to do this. And like I said, you haven't got the neighbours knock on the door because your kids cause trouble. You haven't got the anxiety of what they're up to out there. You haven't got the worries of, are they out getting drunk, or is someone come to steal my kid out on the street? So you can see why a lot of people are happier for that. I know where my kid is safe, but this is exactly the problem we were saying at the beginning, isn't it? It's that trying to get the balance right of providing a safe space for your kid, but without causing harm to them by making it too safe. With the irony that actually the analogy we sometimes use around smartphones, giving a kid with a smartphone with no parental settings and leaving them alone is basically like driving them to the centre of London and leaving them on their own for a couple of days. The dangers are massive. But even if you put all your safety settings on, as we've just been discussing, the dopamine hits, the way, or haven't been discussing as well, the way apps social media apps are set up to keep you on there, to keep those dopamine things going. Games, for kids to do, YouTube videos, even on kids' YouTube, they're designed for quick hitting, give you a dopamine hit onto the next thing. They're designed to keep you there, and that is also a danger. So I think we are catching up as society. We know we are. We talk about it, or society is talking about it an awful lot, and it's a subject that is growing for these worries. And I definitely see that there will be more and more of a push back to be saying, no, kids shouldn't have a smartphone till a certain age. And I do hope that when the current laws in this country come on around internet protections and is it the internet safety bill? Online safety bill, that we do see things that make it harder for kids to access certain stuff like pornography, because we've got loads of research about the impact of that on their development, which actually I think was even touched on in iGen that we haven't come on to either, and the increase of violent pornography impacting the way these children are thinking sex should be. And strangulation is becoming a regular thing, and spitting and hitting, and boys are thinking, oh well, that's what I'm seeing, I'm learning that's what sex is, and going reenacting it, and girls thinking, oh well, I've seen that's what I'm meant to do, and getting themselves into all sorts of messes. So all of that needs to really be looked at to protect our kids as well. And I think at that point we're going to have to leave it because I need to go.
Yeah. Just make it. That was such a morose ending to it.
Is.
You're like, everything's going really bad. I've run out of energy, and yeah.
Sorry, I have. Well, I didn't necessarily come into this with the most.
Drop the mic.
Yeah, most energy anyway. I've definitely. I didn't sleep too well last night, and it took me a while sometimes to structure my thoughts today. And so I started speaking. I was like, I'm just making the same point and rambling and just drifting off now. But yeah,
I'll tell you what. I'll let you edit this one, and you learn.
Yeah, fair enough. But yes. No, it's been a good chat.
Yeah. I just hope the sound isn't completely messed up by the lack of headphones.